Warhammer 40k is a diverse, interesting and complicated game, so where is best to start? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about helping people get the best out of their miniatures on the tabletop. And today we're hopefully about getting more people to put some miniatures on the tabletop in the first place. In today's video we'll be taking a practical look about how to get into the game of Warhammer 40,000 or 40k from an absolute beginner's point of view. That hopefully should also be helpful for returning players who are coming back to see what the new edition is all about. In this video we'll think about why you'd want to play 40k to start with, things that might make you pick a specific army first, some of the practicalities of acquiring miniatures, the things that you'll need to assemble and paint them, and what you'll need to play games of Warhammer 40k, and a few tips once you have got a small force going and are starting to get some games in. So an absolutely enormous topic, we'd better get into this. So first, why would you play 40k to begin with? And there are actually quite a lot of reasons. The setting has an enormous amount of interesting background material and lore. There are potentially infinite tales to be told in the grimdark galaxy of the 41st millennium. And I think that this is one of the reasons that a lot of people come back to it time and again, even when there have been ups and downs with the state of how good the game is. The second is that Games Workshop produces some of the nicest miniatures around. There's nothing really quite like them. That is an enormous company driving the market forward, dedicated to churning out the best miniatures that they can. And because they have such a rich background, when you've painted up a specific Space Marine or army from the universe, you know that it has a setting within that wider fiction, and in my mind gives your little work of art just that little bit more depth than some other things. Say if you just painted up a random miniature from another gaming system without knowing the lore. A lot of people are in the hobby primarily for the painting and modelling aspect. It's really impressive to see what some people can achieve, and it's very satisfying for everyone to try and better themselves at whatever their level is. Third, we have the gameplay. As a 40k tactics channel, obviously this is my main draw to the hobby. The game and the meta of 40k create a ever-changing tactics puzzle, and they allow a lot of creativity and flexibility with how exactly you design your specific army and lead them as best you can to counter the various nefarious threats out there in the galaxy. The sheer amount of models and the various combinations that you can put them together with means that there's a near limitless amount of interest and strategic thinking that you can do within the game of Warhammer 40k, which is quite helpful for me, as it means there's always more to talk about. Most people get a decent amount of satisfaction from each of these areas, although some people are interested in one to the near exclusion of the others. Regardless of whatever you particularly enjoy about the hobby, you certainly won't be alone, and you'll be able to find communities of people who share the same interests. Aside from these main draws of the game, there's also the social element. Playing games against other people gives you a lot of time to really get to know people one-on-one, and as it goes it's a very easy hobby to make new friends through. So once you've actually decided to play Warhammer 40k, assuming you want to do all of the main areas of interest I just mentioned, you're going to be needing to get an army together to be able to play with on the tabletop. That army is going to need to be assembled, ideally painted, and you're going to need to know the rules of the game and the rules of the army. One of the biggest decisions that you can make when you're starting 40k is choosing which army to start with, and again it's the main areas of enjoyment that go into selecting your army. You might really enjoy the lore behind a certain faction, for example how orcs just wage eternal war for the sheer fun of it. You might love the way that a certain army looks, or the dynamic paint scheme that one of the factions has on the table, or you might really like the way that the faction performs in-game. Being strong in the game is one important factor when collecting an army, but I really wouldn't let it be the be-all and end-all, particularly in this new era of Games Workshop with frequent balance updates. What's very strong one year might not be the absolute top dog next year, as they frequently redress the points costs to try and make the game more balanced. So I generally wouldn't advise people to buy models that they don't like the look of or feel of on the table just for being the strongest at the time, as the cycle might turn around and you might regret it down the line. Generally, in terms of gameplay things, the main thing I'd advise as a completely new player is to pick one of the armies that's fairly straightforward and doesn't rely on a lot of complex rules interactions to be strong. There aren't too many armies that are examples of this, but just be aware that if you're playing something like Genestealer Cults or Thousand Sons with a lot of sorcerers and psychic powers, you're in for a lot tougher time learning how to make that army effective compared with some of the slightly more simple point and shoot type armies. Another factor is cost. Some of the armies have a lot of units that are cheaply and easily available that can fill out big chunks of your army in one go. In particular, things like Space Marines and Death Guard have the Dark Imperium box set, so you can get a large amount of models for a relatively small amount of money. Some factions are just a little bit more expensive to field an effective force of compared with others. For example, Custodes are quite cheap due to how few models you need to field an effective army, even if those models are fairly expensive. But again, something like Genestealer cults have a lot of relatively expensive troops choices that don't cost that much in terms of points when you're fielding them as part of an army. So a similar power level army of Custodes versus Genestealer cults is generally going to be a lot cheaper to buy the Custodes. My main advice is just go with something that you're enthusiastic about, some nice looking models, some cool rules, or some awesome lore. Absolutely certainly ask around with any friends or other people who actually collect the armies, and they'll be happy to give you plenty of advice, I'm sure. Once you've decided, you actually need to buy some miniatures. I already mentioned that the Dark Imperium set is a great option if you are interested in Death Guard or Space Marines, not only because they're two quite big armies for a very low price, relatively speaking, but also because you get the big rulebook from this, which is a handy thing for starting the hobby. If you're going for other factions, I'd certainly take a look at their Start Collecting box if they have one. These will tend to give you a reasonable sized force for relatively cheap. I actually did a review of them fairly recently as to which ones I think are best, so feel free to check that out if you're interested. There's also the option of buying pre-owned miniatures. You'll find plenty on eBay, and people might be selling some in your local area, though I'd probably get a second opinion as to whether or not what you're looking at is actually a good deal, as it can be hard to know if you're new. Generally, I wouldn't recommend buying an entire 2,000 point army in one go. I'd start small, maybe just one box of troops, perhaps with a character model to lead them, maybe just a single Start Collecting box. There's nothing to stop you buying more at a later date, and you're not going to be able to put it together and paint it all at once, so my advice is to pace yourself, as you don't want to overload yourself with tons and tons of grey plastic, and potentially make some purchases that you might have avoided later when you were better informed. If you want to save a little money on actually buying in Games Workshop stores, I'd recommend going into non-Games Workshop wargaming stores, which generally offer the same things at a discount. From there, you're going to need some modelling tools, as what you get in a box is a flat pack kit to build your miniatures. First, you'll need to cut them out and glue them together, and for this, some plastic cutters are probably the best tool. At present, Games Workshop sells the Warhammer 40,000 Citadel Essentials set, which has a set of plastic cutters, a bunch of paints, a paintbrush, and some plastic glue, all for a fairly reasonable price. I wouldn't personally recommend buying these individually from Games Workshop, because they're significantly more expensive that way, but this set is actually pretty decent value for what it gives you. Having a good range of paints to start off is certainly very helpful, and you can build up more from there if you need more colours. You can buy plastic clippers very cheaply off online places such as eBay, and you might be able to save a little bit of money there if you didn't want to buy this box. I'd recommend getting a craft knife or a specific mould line remover tool, as basically when you clip a little bit of grey plastic off a miniature, it will leave a random little pointy bit of plastic on your actual model, and it's best to get rid of those because they look a bit silly coated all over your models when you come to put them on the tabletop. They can easily be removed by a sharp craft knife. You'll also need some glue. Some people swear by just using super glue. Personally, I found that plastic glue works absolutely fine. If you're not using the one in this starter set, I'd probably buy it elsewhere from Games Workshop though, as it'll be available significantly more cheap either over the internet or a hobby store. My personal favourite brand is Revel Contactor Polycement, which works very well for me. Games Workshop does make some resin or fine cast kits. For these you'll need super glue. Plastic glue just doesn't work very well for these. I personally use Loctite Mini Super Glue. It's certainly a lot stronger than some of the Games Workshop ones that I've used in the past, but there are plenty of other good brands out there. While you are beavering away assembling miniatures, you want to put something to cover your desk or table. I just get a bit of thick card to prevent it getting glue or scratches all over it, and I'd keep a box for spare parts going at the same time. I'd honestly save every single bit as you're starting out, because they might well be useful somewhere down the line, if you want to change your squad's armament or make some cool conversions later or something. In terms of painting, generally most people will want to undercoat their miniatures with a spray can. Games Workshop has all sorts of shades available for undercoating your miniatures. I'd say that this is worth doing compared with just painting the grey plastic, as it makes the paint stick to the miniature better. Generally, I'd just try and pick the shade that's closest to your model that you're painting as possible, or if you're painting quite a bright colour scheme, you can just undercoat in white and then paint over. You'll then need some paints. Games Workshop has plenty of good resources for advising exactly what sort of paints are best used on specific miniatures. There's a whole ton of really good YouTube tutorials out there as well. How many paints you'll need depends on what sort of level of detail you're going into. I'd honestly focus on just getting some base primary colours down, and then decide if you're going to be doing anything fancy like washes or dry brushes to help give your miniatures a bit more of a 3D feel. To put the paint on your models, you'll need paintbrushes, of course. Again, one comes in that handy 40k start collecting pack. Games Workshop's brushes are very good quality, but if you buy more brushes from them after this, they are very expensive. Unless you're aiming for a very high standard of miniatures, most new miniature painters will do absolutely fine with slightly more budget paintbrushes. If you just Google the words fine detail acrylic paintbrush, then at least in the UK, there are a whole load of different options to buy them for very cheaply, and you can often get 5 or 6 paintbrushes for what Games Workshop would charge for one. They might wear out just a tiny bit quicker, but for me they still absolutely allow me to do detailed freehand at a fraction of the cost that I'd be paying at Games Workshop brush prices. Finally, you'll also want a water pot, somewhere to clean your brush in between when you're changing colours. I wouldn't bother buying something fancy from Games Workshop or elsewhere for this, just use an old mug or cup. There are a whole host of other products that Games Workshop or other people might try and sell you, but if you're fairly new to this, I'd keep things quite basic and just build up some familiarity with putting together and painting miniatures before you try and do anything particularly complex. In terms of actually starting putting your miniatures together, I'd put the first effort into getting a lot of miniatures assembled before you actually move on to painting them. The Games Workshop instructions tend to be pretty decent, so it's not too much of a challenge putting things together. Certain kits accepted. Yes, I'm talking about the drop pod and ghost arc and things like that. Once you have put a decent amount of models together, you can actually start using them to play small games with. If you can, I'd recommend undercoating them as soon as you can, as even just undercoated armies look a bit better than just grey plastic on the tabletop. I'd do a little bit of experimentation on the first few models that you paint. It's going to be a lot better to actually think about the colour scheme that you're going to like the most, and maybe practice a couple of different slight variants on your first couple of miniatures before you dive into painting a whole load of them the same scheme. It's certainly a lot better to make some mistakes on one model rather than deciding you don't like how an entire 10-man squad is looking and giving yourself a lot of extra work. With painting, I'd start simple, then build up complexity. Warhammer TV and lots of other painting channels have great tutorials for new painters. I'd keep things simple, and when you're kind of happy at one level, you can move on to adding new effects such as shading, dry brushing, washes, and lots of other effects. So now we've got some miniatures put together. They might be painted, they might still be grey plastic, but you can certainly start getting some games in. For that, you'll need to start to learn the rules of 40k and the rules for your particular army that you've chosen. Games Workshop has the core rules of 40k available free for download on the Warhammer community website. They go over the basics of a game of 40k, how armies are deployed, and the rules for moving, shooting, and charging your opponent's army. This is the main gameplay of the game, but in terms of actual missions and scenarios, the majority of players tend to have the big rulebook for Warhammer 40k, the one that's available in Dark Imperium, or you can buy it separately. It's a bit of a big weighty rulebook this, it's got a fair bit of background, and the details to actually play some of the standard missions. It doesn't have the rules for the individual armies that you play. These are contained in the Codex books, such as say if you're playing Space Marines, you'd need to pick up Codex Space Marines to know their rules. Each model and unit in 40k has a profile and a points cost. So in Codex Space Marines, you'll find rules for, say, your standard squad of Space Marine intercessors, the core troops for the Space Marines, and it has all the stats for them, including how far they move, how tough they are, what sort of armour they have, what sort of guns they use, and any Codex-specific special rules. For example, intercessors have, and they shall know no fear, which is a rule that helps them pass morale tests a bit better, because Space Marines are known to not run away very much. The Codex also lists the points costs for these units, although Games Workshop has embraced points balance updates, meaning that the points costs for all units in the game are updated each year, and the new points cost is found in the latest Chapter Approved edition. Chapter Approved is a book that comes out in December. It has a new set of missions, all of the new points costs for the different models, and Games Workshop uses it as a way to help rein in the strongest armies and give boosts to the armies that haven't been doing so well. In terms of what to get first as a priority, I would first focus on getting the main rulebook and the codex. They'll do you just fine and allow you to start playing games, and at some point if you want the expanded rules and new points costs, then you can go out to Chapter Approved. I know that not everyone in the game does use Chapter Approved, getting the points from Battlescribe instead, which we'll come on to in a second. In terms of extra rule contents, Games Workshop has an FAQ system where they have pages of clarifications for any hard to understand rules, and also some balance adjustments that they've made to rules that they felt were too strong or not working as intended. Again, you can find these on the Warhammer community website under the FAQ and errata section. Again, these aren't essential for just starting to play, but might be something that you want to look into once you're familiar with the core of the game. As well as all this, there are also other sources of rules, such as expansion books. Games Workshop released a couple of books called Vigilus Defiant and Vigilus Ablaze, largely focused on Imperial and Chaos armies. These are certainly not mandatory, and they're just some extra rules that you can buy if you fancy it. They also have Space Marine supplement books for playing a certain chapter of the Space Marines. Again, not essential. I wouldn't worry about these when you're just starting out, though they might be of interest to you if you are playing that particular chapter. Finally, Games Workshop's latest series of books are the Psychic Awakening books. These are a set of new releases that contain new rules for various factions in the game. Technically, they are the current rules for these armies if you're playing them at some sort of competitive event, but if you're just starting out, I'd very much view these as optional extras as well, and just focus on the rules in the main codex to start with. As with everything, I'd recommend starting with the essentials and then building up as you get to grips with them. In terms of general concepts of the game, armies are usually organised by using points or power level. Points are found at the back of the codex or in chapter approved or on Battlescribe. Power level is the little number in the top left hand corner of the datasheet of each unit and are used for quickly putting models on the table in a bit more of a casual environment where people aren't aiming to optimise their lists and just want to play a quick game. Most people tend to play with points rather than power level, at least in my experience, and they can be a little bit hard to add up because they're located in the back of each codex or chapter approved, and you have to add up both the base cost of each model in the unit and the cost of any of their war gear, so it's a bit fiddly until you get used to it. I wholly recommend using the app Battlescribe. This is a completely free Warhammer 40k list building app. They keep it very up to date, and they usually have the options for the unit in question and the points cost for each of those options baked into the app. I honestly recommend this both for new and regular players alike. They don't always have every rule exactly right, but I'd say for most people, you're likely to have less errors in your list with Battlescribe than if you were just adding up the points cost yourself from scratch. It's just very easy to miss a certain war gear item if you're looking at it from the back of the codex. In terms of equipment that you'll need to play games, the main staples are a tape measure, which is used to measure how far your models can move or whether they're in range of certain other units to fire their guns at them, for example. A decent amount of dice. It might depend on the army that you're using for how many you need. I personally like to have 30 to 50 myself, and I just buy them cheaply off the internet, although a lot of people do like to have the fancy Games Workshop custom dice for their faction. Either way is fine. Having a few objective markers can also be handy, as usually when you're playing a mission you'll put down a certain number of objective markers for your little men to fight over, and these are common in quite a lot of missions. I believe Dark Imperium does come with some, but you can easily just use some scraps of paper or coins, or spare bases for miniatures or things. When you're playing an actual game, you'll usually come to a table, set up some terrain, roll off to see who's deploying where, and then both players will deploy as per the mission that you're playing as rules. From there, the first player will go first. They will move, cast any psychic powers, shoot, charge and fight with their army in that particular order as per the core rules. There'll then be a phase for morale, where if any units lost any casualties that turn, some more might run away. Often you score objectives at the end of the turn as per the rules in the mission that you're playing, and then it'll be the other player's turn to repeat the same process. And typical Warhammer games last between 5 and 7 turns, although they can often end a lot sooner if one player's army is wiped out. There are a few special rules that you can choose to use with your army once you get a little bit more familiar with the game. Your army will have a warlord, someone who leads them into battle. They get to use a special power from the table in your codex. Some of your units might be psychers, using psychic powers in the psychic phase to either boost the powers of your own units or maybe fry enemy units with smite or other offensive spells. There are also relics, certain boosted pieces of equipment that you can give your characters to improve their performance on the battlefield. And each army has its own set of stratagems, powers that you can spend your command points on to activate certain interesting in-game effects, which can be very powerful. I'd honestly not worry too much about each of these in your first few games. Maybe once you get familiar with the way that the core game works, I'd again introduce them gradually until you get a better understanding of them. I'd certainly give the rules a bit of a read before you go and play games, but I wouldn't stress too much if you don't know every little detail. By far the fastest and most fun way to learn the game is to actually play simple games against opponents at local clubs, or potentially at Games Workshop stores themselves. At either of these, there'll usually be people who are absolutely happy to give you a demonstration game in Warhammer 40,000, and it's a lot more intuitive when you have someone explaining to you in person, or correcting you when you're misunderstanding, rather than try and figure it all out on your own before you've even put miniatures on the table. At the start, you'll likely only have a few miniatures to play with. As your collection and army grows, you can get more and more on the table, and if your opponents are happy with it, I'd certainly recommend proxying certain miniatures, meaning use something as a stand-in for other things, so you can try out fun new units and new rules before you actually have the miniatures to put on the table. That way you can decide whether or not you want to buy something, or whether that's a way that you think your army would like to go. At the start, when you're just learning the game, I certainly wouldn't stress at all about winning and losing. If your opponent is actually trying their hardest, you are likely to lose a lot at the start. I'd just experiment, see what works and what doesn't, decide what units might be able to help your burgeoning force win some battles on the table, and develop your own tactics and playstyle. Above all, as I think I've come back to several times in this video, I recommend that you expand gradually, focus on learning one new thing at a time, and above all, don't make the hobby feel like hard work, as after all you're supposed to be having fun, so make sure that you keep enjoying yourself, whether it's the assembling, painting, gaming, or the lore that you enjoy. Well, that was an absolutely massive topic that I feel like I've skimmed over several very important areas of. If there's anything else that you can think that you wish that you'd known when you started collecting 40k, please leave it down in the comments below. I'm sure that I'll have missed things off this list, so if you have any key tips then please share them with other players. At some point I'll be looking to make a basic gameplay tutorial for 40k, and actually go into some detail about how a typical game and a typical turn works when you actually have miniatures on the tabletop. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more videos like this. We have regular 40k content out every day, mostly approaching the game from a tactics and strategy point of view. I also have a Patreon page. If this or any of the other videos are helpful to you, please feel free to drop the channel some support. I also release videos early over there, have some polls on voting which way the channel is going in the future, and I'll be sharing all of my own tournament lists there when I play, so if any of that interests you, then the link is down in the description. Again, thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.